Welcome back to the Harris Library, and here we go into the study of feminism. Last time,
First wave is really, though, all about suffrage. And the suffrage movement and feminism is very much the first wave. The first modern suggestion is in the middle of the English Civil War. It's actually suggested about 1649. It doesn't go anywhere, but it is discussed. You see lots of movement beginning in the late 1700s. You get women like Abigail Adams who are saying, don't forget the ladies and some of the things that you need to deal with here. The coverture law, and that a coverture law simply means that a woman was covered by the male head of the household that she was in. And you also see this in this covers everything up into the granting of suffrage in the United States and in Britain. French Revolution is going to have an impact and is going to radicalize a lot of women who wanted the suffrage because they come close in the French Revolution but just don't get there. And so you get a lot of frustration for women's advocates in this period. In 1848, we see the first kind of international meeting of women's suffrage. It's at Seneca Falls, New York. It's a convention. Here you're going to see the Declaration of Sentiment written, and I've included a copy of this on Canvas for you to look at, if you will. And you'll see some similarities to Declaration of Rights of Women and Citizeness and other bills of rights that you see. And it's about the intents of what they feel like they need to achieve. Now, there were lots of different arguments for suffrage, and there were commonalities between movements. The female experience being different was one of the strongest ones that they used. They argued that subordination of women and oppression of women was an institutional injustice, that you needed to enhance women's voices if you were going to solve some of the social problems. That and the female experience, they blend together a lot. They needed to be able to curb men's influence on their lives, much like what you see in Wollstonecraft's story. There were lots of different places that granted women suffrage first, and I gave you one. In the United States, the first state to do that is Wyoming, but the first country internationally to give women the right to vote is actually in New Zealand in 1893. Now, generally speaking, the places that grant women suffrage first are places where you've got frontier. Frontier societies, women tend to do better. There is a greater acknowledgement of the complementarity of women and men's roles that you don't always see in urbanized industrial societies. It's a little harder to see that. But in a frontier society, you've got to have two people to survive. This is why you don't really see a whole lot of single heads of households. If one spouse dies, the other spouse always remarries. And sometimes you had children being raised in a household who were actually related to neither of the adults, because this one married this one and this one died. And so this one married again. And now this one died, and this one, now the second wife marries a second husband. And so you've got all of these children who have to be taken care of, and you have to deal with all the necessities of life. You also have to have established political frameworks that already have popular political participation. If you don't have men with the right to vote, getting women the right to vote is kind of a non-issue. You have to get the men the right to vote first, and then you start on the women. So this is one of the things where, if you're looking at gender measurements, you need to look at one that actually looks at both the men's experience and the women's experience, not just the women's, because looking at just the women is just like looking at just the men. It's not telling you the whole story. Often the other part that's going to create a women's suffrage is about some sort of service to the state, a national emergency. World War I is going to serve as the catalyst, and women who actually pitch in with the war effort, it's hard to argue that they aren't part of the national war effort after World War I, particularly in Great Britain, but also here in the United States. The British suffrage movement is going to give us a number of different key pieces. And the 19th century had highlighted, like I mentioned, a lot of the property issues. The case of Millicent Garrett Fawcett, she's the woman whose purse is stolen, and it's this huge issue. And that her purse is stolen, but it's actually not legally her purse and her husband. It's her husband's purse, which is kind of embarrassing for him. But it's still going to take a little while to get there. It's going to be 1882 before you get the Great Married Women's Property Act, which gives women the right to hold property while married and earn money and keep it even if they're married. It's now, notice, we're almost a century away from Mary Wollstonecraft writing about this before we get this into law. The biggest issue was suffrage, because it was felt like if women had the right to vote, then they could, in fact, hold office and, in fact, advocate better for the issues that concerned them. Harriet Taylor Mill is going to write, as I mentioned, with her husband on the subjection of women, and she's going to be a very much an advocate for suffrage. The very first women's suffrage committee is formed in Manchester in 1866, right as they're talking about the second Great Reform Bill in Britain. And they're going to begin advocating that, no, you shouldn't just give the right to all the men to vote. You should give it to the women. And there were some small successes in the 1860s from these suffrage committees. And once again, on the local level, in some areas, you would get women the ability to vote on town council issues, and some local referendums, they had the right to vote. It's just not on the national level. Getting it on the national level is the real trick, and that's the difficult one. The first National Suffrage Society is formed in 1888 after the Married Women's Property Act, because they didn't feel like it had gone far enough, and that gave them a better way to advocate. There were a lot of splits in the suffrage movement over whether or not married women really needed the right to vote, or was it just single women or widows who needed the right to vote? Because even some women who advocated for suffrage, even some of the suffragists, are going to argue that, your husband's vote is going to be the same as yours. So why do you need two votes in a household? It's kind of redundant. And giving you more weight because you're a married woman, and then he is a single person. Between 1889 and 1993, you see a lot of the formation of the women's franchise leagues, like the different kind of associations to try and advocate for suffrage. This particular one is critical because it begins in the home of the Pankhursts. Emmeline, Christabel, and Sylvia, who you very rarely hear about. These are not, they don't want any kind of moderation. They want full force. The Pankhursts are probably the most visible symbol of the suffrage movement in Britain. The Women's Political and Social Union, the WPSU, is formed in 1903 by the Pankhursts. There you are with this whole deeds, not words, that we need action, not just words, to get through to these people. Emmeline is the mom. She has three daughters, Christabel, Sylvia, and Adela, whom you hear even less about. Emmeline and Christabel are really, really committed to the cause. And even amongst people who believe women should have the right to vote, we're going to see a serious disagreement over what the real problem is and how you should go about getting it. And it leads to a catastrophic failure of this family unit over the issue of suffrage. Now, Emmeline and Christabel are suffragettes, not suffragists. Now, a suffragist believes that women or men should have the right to vote, okay, depending on the context of what you're talking about. And in this context, women should have the right to vote, okay? The suffragist wants to advocate for that change in lots of different ways. But they're not willing to use violence. A suffragette will use violence. And in fact, they resort to it very quickly. Emmeline and Christabel are suffragettes. Adela disagrees. She doesn't think the violence is a good idea. And she actually is going to argue with her mother on several occasions. And Emmeline has no use for anybody who disagrees with her, and books her daughter a passage to Australia and ships her off, and they never talk to her again. Sylvia is going to actually begin working with the poor, and she's going to kind of go more socialist route, and she's going to see that uh, poverty is the problem, not so much women getting the right to vote. She's not against women getting the right to vote. She's really not. But she thinks that you need this kind of reform that deals with poverty more than you need to go try to attack the prime minister's carriage and try to burn it down. She disagrees. And once again, we see a catastrophic failure of the family unit. And Sylvia barely talks to her mother or her sister the rest of her life. By the way, the husband in this scenario dies fairly early. He does seem to be very much an advocate of women's suffrage and lots of other social reform causes. But I mention all of this with the Pankers because it kind of symbolizes the struggles and the splits within the movement. And it doesn't really brook a lot of give and take, that there are different methods to get to this end. By 1909, the suffragettes are taking center stage. They are getting arrested for various violent acts, and then they're going on hunger strikes while they're in jail. And the authorities get rather frustrated with this, and so they began doing what is known as force feeding them, and you can see that here. And this is when this barely begins. It's called Black Friday, and they start force feeding them. This is going to be a field day for the suffragettes propaganda campaign. And because really they're very frustrated, the authorities they're arresting these women for setting things on fire and chaining themselves to the prime minister's carriage and all kinds of things. And so they arrest these middle-class women, and then they won't eat. And they force feed them. This doesn't go well. This is outrageous for the public. And so in 1913 they passed the Cat and Mouse Act. That's like, okay, you go on a hunger strike, we'll release you when your health starts to get in danger, but we're going to rearrest you once you start eating again. Okay. And it's this kind of round robin that's just a disaster. And then the First World War comes. And many of the advocates for women's rights, including Emmeline and Christabel, decide to sign on for the First World War and advocating and supporting the war effort and helping that. And that actually gains them some allies. Sylvia disagrees. She's a pacifist, and this is another strike against her with her mother. On the United States side, the suffrage is going to be tied a lot with abolition. And very much all the way through the Civil War period, we get a lot of Bible class societies. Bible classes where missionaries societies were organized, but also lots of reform societies. Some were things like Jane Addams, the Whole House supporters. You'll get supporters for mental health reform like that done by an American Equal Rights Amendment movement formed in 1866, and that's kind of making it official. But one of the things, and why I say 1866, what's making it official, is a split eventually that happens between the abolitionists and the suffragists and in the American society. Because with the creation of the Civil Rights Amendments, the Civil War Amendments that come after 13, 14, 15, one frees the slaves, one gives them we get guarantee of due process, and 14 makes them citizens, and then we get the right to vote. And the 15th Amendment is seen as a betrayal by the suffragists. You list everything in this that you can't do it on the basis of religion, servitude, a former consistent of servitude. Blah, blah, blah. Where's women? Where's sex on there? That you couldn't deny women the right to vote. And they just get left out, which is going to make them very frustrated. That those 14th and 15th Amendments. Now, modern day advocates will often say that the 14th Amendment is what gives women. That's what we get the Equal Opportunity Act based under, is the enforcement of the 14th Amendment, and that it applies to people, not just businesses, which is what it's used for initially. And you get two different groups that will form in the United States that are going to be advocating for suffrage: the National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage Association. Um, Both formed in 1869. Eventually, they will combine. And some of these women, you know their names, and you've probably seen their pictures. Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Julia Ward Howe. You're also going to hear Alice Paul and several others in here who are all going to be part of this. Eventually, the National American Women's Suffrage Association is formed in 1890 that combines both of these two competing associations. The United States, what we see is a slow state-by-state suffrage. You can see this here. And notice what you see here is bit by bit. Women get the right to vote in various blue states first. And you get them having the green states, they could vote for president. Before them, they have full voting rights before 19th Amendment and before statehood. And that's where you see these Western states that they're there before they even are states. Okay. They've given women the right to vote in these frontier areas like Wyoming that I mentioned, and of course, Utah and Montana and Washington. But you also have these other places as well. But you'll notice so many of these places don't do it until you get the 19th Amendment. These are older areas, including places like Boston and Pennsylvania and Virginia, southern states. Now, New York does get there before the 19th Amendment, but New York's really kind of the only one. New York and Rhode Island are it for the original 13 colonies. The others are going to take a national amendment to make it happen. I love this one. This is Uncle Sam's newest baby girl, and you can see this is a suffrage cartoon where you're getting all of the various different places where they can begin to vote. Wyoming, who's the oldest there, Utah and Idaho and Colorado and Washington State. And these are the advocates who are helping make that possible. What was the driving force that made this, that helped suffrage get through? Well, some will argue that it's Alice Paul and her militancy on both sides of the Atlantic, and her willing to be a suffragette, to go on hunger strikes, to do whatever it took in terms of violent action to bring this to pass. And the protest march. There's certainly, we're going to see the National Women's Party move created in 1916, which is going to advocate for women's rights issues in the 1916 election and really drive Woodrow Wilson quite up the wall. But you also get in around 1916 the formation of a lot of housewives and suffrage societies that weren't these national ones, but they were suffragists, not suffragettes. And they are like, well, of course I should have the right to vote. I'm an intelligent woman, and I have a different perspective than my husband, and I should be able to bring that. And for the vote, they could agree with some of the more radical activists like Alice Paul, who wants more than just the vote. But a lot of the suffragists just wanted the vote. And in 1919, we'll get the passage of the 19th Amendment, and then it's ratified in 1920. So that's why you've been hearing 100th anniversary stuff about this pretty much constantly.
Well, that's the end of my section on suffrage, and we'll see you next time as I talk about waves 2 through 4 and the final segment on feminism.